Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and here we've got the weapon which some of you will know exactly what it is and some of you won't have a clue. And it's called a Yataghan. That's right. Now, why is it called a Yataghan? How's it defined as a Yataghan? What is a Yataghan? Where does it come from? When was it used? Who used it? We're going to be looking at some of these things in this video. But to start off, a Yataghan is a recurved blade which is found in a lot of the Middle East, some parts of Europe, and quite a lot of Asia as well. So it's spread around the world and was a very successful weapon type. And whilst you get many different variations of them, there are certain common features, and this recurved shape with a point that's sort of in line with the grip is one of those. But before I go into the main video, let's have a little word from our sponsors at Raid Shadow Legends. As you guys know, Raid is the hugely popular game, free to download, free to play. You can play it on your mobile, on your PC. It's a turn-based fantasy combat game that I play quite a lot. Now, you've probably seen Raid Shadow Legends adverts everywhere, but I want to talk to you about something different about the game. What really makes Raid stand out is the production quality and incredible level of detail. Raid's got over 450 unique champions, and every single one is fully animated with the help of our in-house motion capture studio. Mocap is how they get all those super fluid movements and attacks that you can see in the game, and they rig each character model to move and behave individually. You can see in the way that they hold their weapons, the way they stand, their fighting style, everything. It's crazy. So one of the things I really enjoy is upgrading my characters, making them tougher so that I'm going to do better in arena battles or in the dungeons, for example, getting better times. You get better times, you can get better rewards. Let's see. I've only got a low chance of this succeeding, but you essentially use credits each time you try and... Yes! So I've upgraded his weapon. Remember that when you do things, like I just upgraded a weapon, you get rewards, which means that you get more money and potions and all that kind of stuff, energy. One of my absolute favourite things to do in Raid Shadow Legends is play arena battles against other people's teams. Ouch! I also really enjoy fighting in the dungeons where you can try and get better times. You get better times, you get better rewards, you get... So what's coming up for Raid in the future? Raid's always releasing new updates, and their biggest update ever is in development right now, the Doom Tower. It's 120 floors of super hard levels and even harder bosses. The Frost Spider, the Magma Dragon, the Tomb Crab, they all look badass. You'll need to build special teams and strategies to beat them, and I can't wait to dive in and start playing myself. So you can find me in game under the name Captain Context, of course, and if you're quick enough you can even join my clan. So what are you waiting for? Go to the link in the video description below, click on the special links, and if you're a new player you'll get 100,000 silver plus one free champion, the Grumbler. And he's a really good champion. I actually don't have many dwarves myself, so it's a really good one to get started with. All this treasure will be waiting for you up here in the treasure box inbox. And what are you waiting for? I'll see you there. These rewards are only for new players and only for the next 30 days. So thanks for staying with us. Now back to the main topic of the video, that being Yataghans. Now, I'm not going to be looking particularly at the origin of the Yataghan because that's actually somewhat obscure, somewhat lost to the mists of time. It does seem that the Yataghan type of blade does originate in Ottoman Turkey, probably in the middle of the 16th century, but it may have earlier origins than that, and it may own its original idea, its inception to earlier types of blade that were in use. But really we don't start to see what we would commonly refer to as Yataghans. We don't see them really before the 16th century. They appear really at the height of the Ottoman Turkish Empire's power. And it also should be noted that there is a place in the southern part of Turkey called Yataghan. Now again, does the blade take its name from that place? That seems to be the common agreement, but sometimes we even find places named after weapons, or sometimes it could be a coincidence of name. The etymology of the word Yataghan seems to refer to a bend, and indeed it does have a bent blade, and we'll talk a bit more about that recurve in a little bit. This incidentally is not a Turkish Yataghan. This is a 19th century military made of unknown origin, probably British Empire because it's got Indian writing on the spine of the blade, but it's it is nevertheless a yataghan blade. Now, what defines a yataghan blade? Well, first of all, it is predominantly single-edged. So you'll notice it has a thick spine at the back and obviously an edge at the front. This one is not sharpened, so don't worry about me cutting myself. So first of all, it's predominantly single-edged, although it does sort of become double-edged at the point. But the thing which really marks it, and lots of knives are like that, they're single-edged of course and double-edged at the point, but what really marks this out as a yataghan, and what everyone would agree that this is a yataghan blade, is this recurve. So you'll notice that it comes forward, a bit like various other types of khopesh and falcata and even kukris do. It comes forwards, which we know assists with certain types of chopping action and can make cleaving blows more powerful, and can also mean that you can slice in different ways that you can't with a straight or a backwards curved blade. So it tilts forward, but then it recurves again. So essentially a yataghan is defined predominantly by this point, that it is a recurve blade. It goes forwards and then it goes back. Now, why would you want a blade to do that? Well, first of all, we've talked about the forwards curve assisting with cleaving power, and there was a French officer by the name, a colonel called Colonel Marey-Monge, who wrote a book called A Memoir on Swords, which I will link below this video. And it's been translated into English. In fact, it was translated into English in the middle of the 19th century. By a British officer who was interested in this stuff. And in fact, the English translation only survived by chance during the Indian Mutiny, when the so-called mutineers were looting all of the officers' gear. The book got thrown into a ditch, and then later on, British soldiers, I think, recovered it, and it was returned to him. So it survived the Indian Mutiny by chance in translation, and he made additions to it, shall we say, in the translated version. But it's a fantastic source. It deals with all types of blade shapes, and it talks also about physics, and it talks about the science behind why certain, or at least why he believed certain blade types worked better or worse at certain things. And he talks about blade design, all types of blades, straight thrusting blades, recurved blades, forward curved blades, backwards curving blades. And he talks about hilt design as well, both in terms of guard. He talks about symmetrical guards versus asymmetrical guards, a topic I've covered much on my channel. And also he talks about grip shapes. So it's a fantastic book, and it's free to view. I absolutely recommend, if you've got the time to, go and read Colonel Marey-Monge's, or the English translation of Colonel Marey-Monge's Memoir on Swords. It's really a really interesting work. And for those of you who are inclined towards physics and science, it'd be interesting to know how right he got it, because I suspect that some of it is approximately correct, if not exactly correct. But anyway, and I also think some of his explanations for why he thought certain things worked well or not well are not necessarily on the money. But anyway, that's a topic for another video. So this yataghan blade is a recurve blade. Now, Colonel Marey-Monge looked at these Turkish yataghans, and he regarded them as fantastic blade types. Why did he regard them as fantastic blade types? Well, fundamentally, his argument, which I basically agree with, is you gain the advantages of a forwards curved blade, which means that you're meeting the thing you're hitting at a slanted angle, which, much like a backwards curved blade, means that it's like walking diagonally up a hill. You're reducing the angle, you're making the angle more acute in terms of passing through the target. So you meet less resistance essentially as you pass through the target. And he describes it, or at least the translation describes it, as making the blade effectively sharper. Now, that's a confusing term, because obviously sharpness is just to do with how fine you make the edge, and whether it's a toothy edge and all this kind of stuff, or polished edge. But what he was really talking about was, it means that the edge bevel essentially becomes a shallower angle, and less obtuse, and is therefore likely to cut into the target more effectively. I think this is partially true. This is an important factor. I don't think with a forward curving blade that's the end of the story. With a forward curving blade, it has a degree of hooking action in it, which tends to pull things you're hitting. And bear in mind, this isn't a sharp blade. If you're doing this with sharp blades, don't put your finger against the edge. But it tends to pull the target in towards you, rather than pushing the target away from you. But either of those things increase the drawing effect. Now, anybody who uses knives or lots of other tools, in fact, on a regular basis, will know that if you just push a blade into a thing, yes, it might cut if it's very sharp, but if you now slide the blade forward or pull it back, it will cut a lot more effectively and a lot more deeply. So when you have a curved blade, not only do you meet it at a more slanted angle, but what happens after the moment of impact, if it's a forwards curved blade, it means that it essentially turns it into a draw cut. Push cut, or if it's a backwards curved blade and you meet it like this, it turns it into a draw cut. So it adds a push or a pull to the cut, which naturally, added to the arc of the movement of the cut itself, makes it into a more effective cut. And I think there are other factors involved here as well. Very, very complicated, in fact, and I think boiling it down into simple physics is not the answer. It's actually, a lot of the time, it's just better to do the experimentation and see the results. And that's what we tend to do in channels like mine and other similar channels. And often the results will just give you an easier answer than trying to work it out on paper. But I think there are many factors involved. But essentially, the forwards curved, as he argued correctly, makes for a more effective cleave or chop. But then the backwards curve gives you access to the point. Now, if I just grab this one's sharp, so I'm not going to rub my finger against the edge. If I grab a kukri, the kukri has devoted almost everything to the forwards curve. This means that kukris are famously fearsome choppers. And whilst you can use the point, use it differently, use it almost like a pistol grip, like that, kukris, it seems that they were, historically anyway, in the modern world people can do what they like, but historically they were rarely used to thrust with. And the grip is not necessarily set up for thrusting either, it's set up primarily for cutting. You can thrust with it, I'm not saying you can't thrust with a kukri, but it's not really optimized for that. A yataghan, on the other hand, has come back from that forward curve and gives you this recurve at the end. So you've got maximum chopping potential here, but you still, by putting the point in line with the grip or the hand, have very good thrusting potential. Okay, so that's the purpose of this design. It's a good chopper and a good thruster. It's a compromised design. Okay, so it's kind of, I always say how when you try and compromise, you lose things, and that is true. The best thrusting blade will be a straight blade, but this is a rare example of a blade which is tried to increase its cutting capacity and increase its thrusting capacity. It's a very rare thing in the history of weapons from that point of view. So back to the history now. So this is a Yataghan blade. This isn't a Turkish example, but it seems that the earliest examples were Ottoman Turkish. Probably, maybe it was much like the Basilard coming from Basel in Switzerland. Maybe the Yataghan's origin was in Yataghan in southern Turkey. Maybe, I think it's southwest Turkey. But what we do know is what came after that. So once this type of blade in Turkey, and incidentally the Turkish examples usually have ears, as they're called, at the pommel end, which keep the grip in place, the hand in place on the grip and make them for a very secure grip. Other regions in the Ottoman Empire didn't always have exactly the same design of Yataghan. So as most of you, or many of you will know, the Ottoman Turkish Empire was very big, and it covered what's now some of South and Southeastern Europe. It covered some of North Africa. It covered a very big area, in fact. So the Ottoman Turkish Empire was big, but it encapsulated a lot of cultures, and not just Islamic populations, also Christian and various other, Jewish and other. So the fact is that the Ottoman Empire came into contact with a lot of different cultures, so it absorbed some of those things into the Ottoman Empire, but it also spread out Ottoman culture to those regions as well. Okay, and one of the things it spread was the Yataghan, but the Yataghan wasn't always adopted in those regions in its unadulterated state. Very often when the Yataghan was adopted, for example in the Balkans, if you look at Balkan or Greek Yataghans, they don't look the same as Turkish Ottoman Yataghans. Despite the fact that they were within the Ottoman Empire, they look slightly different hilts, sometimes slightly different blades, although the blades change less than the hilts do. Also decoration on the scabbard, for example, the scabbards vary between regions. So when we find an antique Yataghan, despite the fact it might be fundamentally Ottoman, we can sometimes say with some degree of speculation where in the Ottoman Empire it might have come from. Okay, right, so Marey-Monge looked at these Turkish yataghans and said, that's a really good blade. Now, Colonel Marey-Monge was based in North Africa at the time. I think Morocco, could have been Algeria, I can't remember which, but he was either in Morocco or Algeria. So, as many of you know, France had a considerable empire in the 19th century, just like Britain did and just like the Ottoman Turkish Empire did. And the French had military bases all over North Africa. And much of North Africa was French colony. And he'd been involved in campaigning in the around the second quarter of the first and second quarter of the 19th century in North Africa. And during that time he had taken a large interest in bladed weapons and he had used them. And not only had he taken an interest in bladed weapons and used them, but he'd also started designing them. And that's the important thing. And for those of you who are aficionados on 19th century British military history, you will know of Brigadier General John Jacob of the Cinder Regular Cavalry, and he's a similar character to John Jacob, but the French equivalent. So Marey-Monge started designing swords and testing them out. I believe for himself, but perhaps also for his men as well, for the cavalry serving under him. And it has to be said, for anyone who doesn't know, just the same as British officers in India and Afghanistan and places like that often used unconventional weapons and equipment. You know, khaki as the colour was pioneered out there as a more camouflaged option to wearing bright red or blue. Similarly, in the French army, it was for example, the chasseurs d'Afrique, the African chasseurs, that pioneered the use of certain types of weapons. And in many cases, the officers of the African serving officers in the French army used unconventional swords. Now, Colonel Marey-Monge wasn't only concerned with cavalry swords, he was also concerned with infantry swords. And as you'll see if you read a memoir on swords, he argued that the best compromise blade to give infantry, if you're going to give them a sword, either as a backup sword or if they're pioneers and they're carrying swords already or whatever, for infantry, the best kind of sword is a yataghan. So his opinion was that if you want to combine maximum cutting power with maximum thrusting potential, that I won't go into hilt design because that's a whole different topic, he considered the yataghan blade was spot on. Now, did anyone listen to him? I have seen people say that, oh, well, Marey-Monge had some very interesting ideas, but he was ignored. He wasn't, okay? Literally, so he was writing, I think, in the 1830s. The English translation, I think, is from about 1840 or 40-something. And literally, in 1840, what happens but the French army, for the first time ever, decides to introduce a yataghan blade as a bayonet. Now, a lot of people argue that that means that was stupid, okay, because a yataghan is a great cutting implement, and it's a pretty good thrusting implement as well, but it was a stupid thing to introduce it as a bayonet. Well, I vehemently disagree, and I disagree for two important reasons. Number one, a bayonet, particularly a bayonet of this size, wasn't intended to spend its entire life on the rifle. Yes, it could be used as a bayonet, and I'll come back to that as my second point in a minute, but as a hand weapon, it's a pretty decent sword. Now, this was one of the first antique swords that, not this particular one, but a same model. This is actually an 1866 Chassepot yataghan bayonet, but there was an earlier 1840 model that precedes this, which is rarer, so hence I have an 1866 to hand. But this was actually one of the first models of antique it's the closest thing to a sword that I owned. I think when I was about 14 or 15, I bought it in a militaria shop. And at the time, that was the closest thing to an antique sword that I could afford. In other words, it was the biggest bayonet I could afford. And these are pretty good short swords. They are, you know, they've got a decent cutting potential, great thrusting potential, reasonable hand grip. I'll talk a bit about the grip in a second. But the important thing is these weren't only intended to be used as bayonets. That's my first point, okay? So as a hand weapon, and why might you dismount it from your rifle? Say you're going into a building, say you've got to clear out some people out of a room. You might go in at bayonet point, but have you seen 19th century rifles, particularly the Chassepot rifle? It's a long, and especially with a bayonet on the end, it's a long, unwieldy thing. If you're going to charge into a room, or perhaps even you're fighting in jungle or whatever, you're fighting in trenches maybe, you're fighting in an environment where a long rifle and bayonet, just like in World War I when they adopted clubs and trench knives and this kind of stuff, sometimes you don't want a great big long pole arm, you want something shorter because of the environment you're fighting in, okay? So, having a hand weapon on hand like this, and this is a good hand weapon, very, very good thing. And it is a good one. The second point is the point. Yet again, the point is the point. Now, this is a good thrusting point, but importantly, when this was introduced in 1840, what were firearms? They were not breech loading for the most part. They were muzzle loading. Now, with a muzzle loading rifle, you have to do this down your barrel. For that reason, socket spike bayonets are curved away from the line of the barrel. The Yataghan already does that, so it literally ticks all the boxes, it hits all the bases. It's got a recurve blade that is effective for cutting and for thrusting, therefore it's also effective on the end of a rifle, and because or a musket, and because you've got a muzzle loading musket or rifle and your hand has to do this, it means that the point is not going to stab into your hand when you're ramming down the barrel, which is in line with that hole there. Okay, now I said I would mention the grip. One of the things I don't like about the Chassepot or its predecessor, the 1840, is that, I should have said the Chassepot bayonet rather than Chassepot rifle, is this rather uncomfortable to hold groove right up the back of the grip. It means that the grip is okay to hold, but it feels a bit weird in the hand. It's not particularly comfortable, and it's also quite a skinny grip, I've got to say, and a little bit prone to turning. The fact that it's a recurve blade actually makes the turning issue less of an issue, but nevertheless, not a great grip, quite French. So what did the British do? That's right, the British went along and basically copied the idea, but stuck a better grip on it. A better grip in some ways and a worse grip in other ways. I'll talk about the worst in a second. Now, it's a better grip because it's built like a sword grip of the time, so it's a full width tang with leather scales riveted on each side. This came in 1856, incidentally, but the grip is very clearly modelled on the 1853 Reeves patent full width tang cavalry sword. So it's got a sword-like grip that is much more comfortable in the hand, and it's a bit fatter as well, and it's oval, so it doesn't turn in the hand. This, incidentally, the British version, the British Yataghan for the Enfield rifle, is slightly broader and beefier than the French one. I'm not going to make any nationalistic comments about British versus French here. That's for another channel, not for mine. But yeah, a beefier blade. I do prefer the British one as a weapon. It feels bigger, beefier, and it's got a better grip on it. Now, I said I'd mention one disadvantage. There is a disadvantage in that these leather grip scales deteriorate if they get wet. Okay, and they swell up and they get misshapen. They can be replaced, or they could be replaced because you could just get new grips and rivet them on there. But in terms of kind of 150 years later, where we are now, the brass grips survive in much nicer condition than the British leather grips do. But I do think the blade's definitely nicer on the British one, and ergonomically the British grip's better. I should also mention before I move on that this was only issued, or predominantly only issued, to sergeants. This wasn't put wide scale in the British military. Okay, so it was given to sergeants because they had shorter rifles specifically. So just to finish off, as well as influencing bayonets and military arms in Europe or within the European colonial military sphere, these Ottoman Turkish Yataghans also, because the Ottoman Empire was in contact with lots of other areas around, for example the Persian Empire, and via the Persian Empire into Afghanistan and into India, the fact is that Yataghans as a blade concept spread. But we've also got to be careful to point out that the basic idea of the Yataghan wasn't necessarily new, it wasn't necessarily invented by the Ottoman Turks. If we look back to the falcata of the ancient era, for example, you can see basically something that's quite similar to a falcata, quite similar to a Yataghan, all the way back in the falcata and the kopis, definitely. So it wasn't an entirely new idea, but in terms of the 18th and 19th centuries, I think it's fair to say that most weapons that are Yataghan-like, and we'll look at one in a second, were probably influenced by the Yataghan. Now, there were others, but a very famous example, seen on this channel before, is the Afghan, or from Afghanistan, Pashtun khyber knife known as a chara or chura or peshkabs. And this particular type of khyber knife, as the British generally referred to it, was very feared and very clearly is somewhat related to the Turkish yataghan, probably via the Persians, because the relationship between Persia and Afghanistan, often not a good relationship, but nevertheless there was a lot of cultural exchange and exchange of bullets in both directions over a long period of time. So undoubtedly the famous Afghan khyber knife probably at least partly owes its design to the Turkish yataghan, and probably we could say that the card in India probably does as well, although it's one step removed. It should be pointed out that one feature that we find shared between a lot of these blades is a T-section, and I have talked about this T-section on khyber knives previously. That is that the blade here is allowed to be quite thin because it's given rigidity by a T-section, like one half of a H-beam or I-beam at the back. Now this isn't always present on the military ones. For example, if we look at this unidentified 19th century one, it's just a wedge section. It doesn't really have a T-section at the back. It has a fuller, but the cross-section is basically like most cavalry swords would be of the time. Same is true of the British yataghan bayonet. It doesn't really have, it has a thick spine, but it's overall, if we look at the base of the blade, it's a wedge section, not a T-section. The French one is halfway between, so it's sort of a wedge section at the base of the blade, but actually it's so deeply fullered that it almost becomes a T-section. And I do suspect that the French one is closer to the original T-section of the Turkish yataghans, because it was based on Colonel Marey-Monge's works and was explicitly supposed to be based on the Ottoman Turkish yataghans. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. Do check out the link below to Colonel Marey-Monge's work, and of course the Raid Shadow Legends link as well. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you really soon again for another video on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.